All right. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's discussion of Georgia's new election law. My name is Megan Turnbull, and I am an assistant professor of comparative politics in the Department of International Affairs here at UGA. I'm really excited to moderate this panel of excellent scholars who bring expertise on Georgia's politics, American politics, and beyond. We'll first hear opening remarks from our panelists before shifting to a discussion where our panelists will answer questions that some of you have submitted in advance. And you can also submit questions during the webinar via the Q&A function. So let me first introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. Dr. Trey Hood is a professor in the Department of Political Science and the director of SPIA's Survey Research Center. His research primarily focuses on Southern politics and election sciences, with specialties in election results, the Electoral College, election security, forecasting, in-person and mail-in voting, and voter behavior. Dr. Alexa Banker is an assistant professor in the Political Science Department, also at UGA. Her research examines the role of identity and political behavior and how group identities shape political attitudes, vote choices, and other forms of political participation. Dr. David Cottrell is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, and his research uses empirical and computational methods to explore how rules and procedures distort representation in the United States. Dr. Molly Cohen is an assistant professor of comparative politics in the Department of International Affairs. She studies elections, public opinion, voting behavior, and political representation, especially in the Latin American region. Much of her work focuses on the individual and contextual factors that fuel voters' decisions to cast blank or spoiled ballots. In related work, she examines elite responsiveness to protest voting, the measurement of electoral behavior, and the effects of health crises on public opinion. And finally, Dr. Chad Clay is the director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues and is an associate professor in the Department of International Affairs. His work focuses primarily on the determinants of human rights practices, collective dissent, political violence, and economic development. He is also the co-founder and civil and political rights metrics lead for the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, co-principal investigator on the Worker Rights in Law and Practice Data Project, and the Subnational Analysis of Repression Project. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hood for his opening remarks.
Okay, thank you. So let me get to, I've got some outlines here to maybe help us along. So I think the first thing to think about is sort of a big tent view of things. And when we talk about election administration, there's really three pillars: access, integrity, sometimes called ballot security, and finality. And one of the ways I think about this is that these are three legs of a stool. You can't have a stool with one or two legs. You've got to have all three. And the legs have to be fairly proportionate, right? You can't have a leg that's a foot long and another one that's 2 feet long. It just doesn't work. So it's always a balancing act. Election administration is always a balancing act between these factors. So to get us started, I think it's really important that we understand the current election code and how SB 202, which is the bill we're talking about, changes that. And that's really the only way to understand this. The media, regardless of what you think about the bill, has done an absolutely horrendous job in explaining things to most people. It's gotten better after a couple of weeks, but at first it was just really horrific. Now, this is a 98-page bill, and I've gone through the bill and looked at it, read most of it. I won't say exactly every word in the bill, but most of the bill. And again, to understand how things change, you have to look at, well, what's the pre-existing election code say, and how does the bill change that election code? So I've got things divided up into these two columns, and also in terms of factors that affect individual voters, and then sort of administrative factors in carrying out elections in Georgia. And again, there's a little bleed over between these categories. So What changed? Well, one of the biggest things that changed is that prior to the current law, absentee ballots were verified in Georgia using a signature match criteria. There was a lot of legal wrangling over this. There were questions about, this is subjective, et cetera. So one of the things that the bill does, and in my opinion, one of the bigger things the bill does is drops the signature match verification requirement for absentee by mail ballots to require someone to just record their driver's license or state ID number on the ballot. Now, all of these provisions, there are more details underneath what I'm giving you here, and we can talk about those. Now, note you don't have to actually copy your ID and send it in. It's just recording your driver's license or state ID number on your absentee by mail ballot. Absentee drop boxes. So there were drop boxes in place for the 2020 general election and the 2021 runoff. There was no provision in the election law for absentee ballot drop boxes. They were put in place by emergency powers under the pandemic. So now that's been codified by the new law to provide absentee ballot drop boxes at early voting sites or election offices, and then other specific procedures, about collecting ballots every day, and a lot of other things are outlined in the code. Absentee ballot request deadline, and just as an aside, I'm not going to talk about every provision in this law. But these are, I think, the more major ones. So used to be, you could request an absentee ballot, about half a year up to 4 days prior to the election. That's been altered to 78 days prior to an election, up to 11 days before the election. Early in-person voting, Saturdays previously were optional on early in-person voting. Now the 2 Saturdays are mandated. Early in-person voting Sundays were optional. Now counties can give up to 2 Sundays. Again, those are still optional, but they're there. Early voting hours. Previously, the code described things as having early in-person voting during normal business hours. Now you can see over on the right, that's defined in terms of times. Normal business hours 9 to 5, but counties can extend up to 7 to 7. So this has received a lot of media attention, certainly, this ban on food and water. In some ways, the specific words of the ban are new, but it really clarifies an existing ban against electioneering at polling places and within 150 feet of a polling place. Mailing out absentee ballot applications. If you'll remember, during the primary, the Secretary of State's office did that. You're not going to be allowed to do that. That was only done during the emergency powers again. So you can, of course, request an absentee ballot application, but they're not going to do any more mass mailings from the Secretary of State's office. And then so those are some things that might affect you as a voter. And the next couple of things are more administrative. Runoff elections were 9 weeks following the general election. Now they've been moved back to 3 weeks following the election. And that's how they used to be a while back, a few years back. UOCAVA voters, that stands for military and overseas voters. Used to be if you were a military or overseas voter, you'd have to get a new ballot if there was a runoff. Now on your general election ballot, you can have what's called ranked choice voting, or those voters can have ranked choice voting. So they don't have to get another ballot for the runoff. And again, we can talk about all these provisions in more detail, I'm sure. Out of precinct ballots. So if you're voting on election day at the wrong precinct, those used to be partially counted. Now they're not going to be counted at all. So you need to go to the right precinct is what this means on election day. Underperforming county election superintendents. Prior to this law, there was really no provision for removal. Now the state can replace underperforming county election superintendents by someone appointed by the Board of Elections. The Secretary of State used to be the chair of the State Board of Elections. This law removes the Secretary of State from being the chair of the state board, and the chair is appointed now by the General Assembly. Poll workers, used to be poll workers, you had to work in the county where you were a resident. Now you can work outside of that county as a poll worker. Special elections, as we just saw with the special Senate election in 2020, and used to be the primary for those used to be a jungle primary format where Republicans were running against Democrats and Green Party and whoever else, Libertarians. Now you're going to have a special primary before the special election by party. The new law allows absentee ballots to be scanned beginning the third Monday prior to election day. So not technically tabulated, but once you scan them, all you have to do is push a button to tabulate. So processing, what this means basically in plainer English, processing ballots earlier. And so once you get to election day, there's not this backlog. Precinct wait times. So now if the precinct has a wait time that exceeds an hour in the next general election, the county is going to have to make some adjustments to either reduce the size of the number of voters in the precinct or add additional staff and voting machines to make sure that the line doesn't extend over an hour. And so those are the major provisions of the law. I want to share one more thing. This was a poll we did for the AJC back in January. So this was before the law was passed. And you'll notice the question's a little bit different from what actually happened. This asked the question about whether voters should be required to include a copy of their photo ID, a copy. Now you just have to write your driver's license number. But even so, again, this was a poll of Georgians, 74% overall approved, really approval across all demographic groups here, 81% of whites, 63% of blacks, 55% of liberals, 67% of moderates, 91% of conservatives, 92% of Republicans, 56% of Democrats, 86% of independents. So I'll just leave it there. And so hopefully we sort of have a baseline of information to be able to talk about the law from an informed perspective rather than relying on media sources, which again, have not done a really great job, in my opinion, thus far. So I'll stop talking there.
All right, I think Dr. Banker, you're up next.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you everyone for being here today. I'm talking especially right now to the students in the audience. Now the semester is probably really, really busy with exams and final papers, at least based on my students' feedback. And so you being here today is really commendable, and I'm glad you're here. So we just learned a lot about this new law, right? Like lots of details and specifics. And here's the irony. You can easily look this up online, right? Like this is accessible to everyone. And yet we come to completely different conclusions regarding the impact of this law. And so in the following few minutes, I will talk a little bit about the reasons for that, right? So how can we explain this huge discrepancy in the perception of the law based on our partisanship, of course. And here, part of the answer will in fact include my own research, which is on what we call negative partisanship, right? So ironically, many Americans feel very lukewarm about their own party. They aren't actually that excited about their own party, but they really, really hate the other party. Right? So there is this like really concrete dislike or almost disdain towards the opposing party. And here's what is always interesting about this. This dislike is in many cases independent of actual policies, right? So we now hate the other party regardless of what kind of policies they want to enact. We don't care anymore. In fact, I doubt that most people have actually read the law, right? All we really look for at this point is who has been supporting this bill, right? Like who is sponsoring it. And that cue alone is enough for us to make some form of judgment about the bill's impact, about the law's impact, right? And so here we really see that in these polarized times, we no longer care really about policy content. We care much more about the party who is supporting the policies. And that obviously leads to problems because it leads, as we see now, to huge misunderstandings regarding the actual content of the bill. And one thing to keep in mind here is that the media, as Professor Hood has already elaborated, has not been great with this coverage, right? And in many cases, we talk about motivations behind the bill, right? And one thing to keep in mind here is those are inferences, right? We're making inferences about the other party's motivations behind a particular bill. So right now, the narrative is Republicans are trying to suppress the vote. Democrats are trying to misrepresent the bill on purpose for gains. And again, those are inferences we make about the motivation of the other party. But these inferences don't always have to be true, right? The problem here is really that we assume that the opposing party's motivation is bad, right? And therefore, any conversation about the true content of the bill is actually useless because you're already assuming that the motivation is bad, it's detrimental, right? So as we walk through this panel today, maybe take a step back from these assumptions, right? Like the motivation of the other party. Again, these are very difficult to really prove. And then the other reason I think why we have some misunderstanding here is when it comes to the baseline, we are comparing the effect to, right? So of course we can compare Georgia's law to other states' laws, right? Like I think that's what's happening right now a lot. But anyone who has ever moved across states probably knows that there are a lot of differences across states that make this comparison really, really hard, right? So think about population density, think about infrastructure, even think about like it's a battleground state or not. All of these are different factors really influencing or interacting with the electoral law in a particular state. And so simply saying, but in state A, B, C, we have a similar law, it's a little bit misleading because it doesn't quite yet tell us the complete picture about the impact of the law. And I'm pretty sure that Professor Cottrell will be able to talk much more about that. And there has in fact been a new report today coming out from the Center for Election Innovation and Research. And they actually have ranked Georgia's election access among the top tier of states in the country, right? Again, and that's even after this new law has been passed. Yet we have been considered top tier in the country. And again, difficult to compare, but this is a nonpartisan center really telling us that in comparison to other states, if you want to go there, we're actually in the top tier compared to other states, right? And yet the center admits that the law is a step back, right? But that's why the comparison is so important. What are you comparing the election law effect to? Is it to other states? Is it within Georgia across time? And these timeframes are sometimes chosen deliberately, strategically, right? And so be aware of these comparisons and how they are chosen for effect. And then last, of course, our own echo chambers. Right, and that's related to our polarization again. We are polarized. We like to listen to people who already agree with us, who tell us that we are right, that our prior attitudes are in fact the only possible solution to policy problems. And so very frequently people aren't aware of the fact that their news outlets are partisan or do have some form of bias. For that, I always advise students to go to the website allsides.com. That website is categorizing major news outlets along partisan lines. So at least you can somewhat factor in the possibility of potential partisan bias whenever you watch your own news, right? And so here, whenever it comes to election laws and their impact, maybe seek out some non-partisan sources and compare them to your own partisan sources. So you can actually see, well, is that really the way that this law is meant to be? Is there maybe a different way to cover the law, right? Politics is complicated, it's messy, and so there are multiple ways to really talk about a particular policy. So keep that in mind, right? Like media too chooses certain frames on purpose frames that really benefit them too, right? And even party leaders are guilty of that on both sides, by the way. We have seen that both party leaderships have been using very interesting rhetorical tools and frames to really dramatize, like the election law, right? And again, that is a deliberate decision, right? Because it works on us. We get worked up, we get angry, and angry is profitable in politics. So keep it in mind, right? Like words are chosen on purpose for certain gains. And so overall, keep in mind here, when we talk about politics, this is about conflict. If we didn't disagree on issues, then what is the point of even having a democracy? Right. So this, what we're doing right now here, is a good thing. That is, I think, a sign of a functioning democracy. We're disagreeing on key policies, right? And I think that's, again, that is exactly what politics is. It's trying to find an agreement amid disagreement, right? And so I think as long as we're really valuing the quality of our decision-making process more than our partisan loyalties, I think we're actually on a good path, on a good trajectory. And so, let's just keep that in mind as we keep debating the merits of this law. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Cottrell.
Okay, so unmute. Always got to unmute. So, so I'm going to, I don't have a ton to say. Dr. Hood mentioned a lot about what I was going to go over. And I agree with Dr. Hood that a lot of the restrictions have been overblown or overhyped by the media. But nonetheless, there are a number of restrictive measures in the bill that are just gratuitous and unnecessary, given that they're done in an effort to ensure election integrity or fight voter fraud. When there really is no reason to think that the integrity of this last election was actually compromised. So when you have Republicans passing a bill along party lines that was presented as a bill that is going to combat voter fraud, Democrats are naturally going to be concerned about voter suppression, especially given that the claims of voter fraud were in this last election were manufactured mainly by members of the Republican Party. However, although these restrictions are gratuitous in many ways and mostly unnecessary, I think it's less clear as to what is actually going to happen as a result of this, especially in terms of voter suppression and suppressing turnout or reducing turnout. Just because you add a restriction doesn't necessarily mean that a voter isn't going to turn out, that they may in fact use other means to turn out. And to give you an example of this, in Texas, we have no excuse absentee voting here in Georgia, but in Texas, it's for individuals 65 and older. And you don't really see, there's an analysis of this in the last election by some people at Stanford, and you don't really see a major bump in turnout among the 65-year-olds compared to those who are almost 65, but are 64 and therefore not eligible to have for no excuse absentee voting. You see less use of absentee voting by the 64-year-olds, but the turnout is essentially the same. And so there's not a huge effect with something that you would think is providing a lot more access to the poll, or a lot more options for voting, especially voting absentee. So it's unclear, I think, as to whether or not this is going to keep a number of people from turning out, that it's going to make a huge difference in the next election. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that this is going to stop a lot of people from turning out. Nonetheless, there are restrictive measures, and Dr. Hood mentioned a lot of, essentially all of them, but there's also improvements. So some of the restrictive measures is that now you have to have voter ID to vote by mail. It shortens the period for applying for absentee ballots. It limits the number of drop box locations and the time that you can drop your ballot off in a location. Shortens runoff periods to vote during the runoff period and the early voting during the runoff period. And it has this somewhat gratuitous prohibition against handing out food and water as gifts. But, again, there were rules against electioneering, and, the consideration is that this is a form of electioneering. There are major improvements, the requiring that early voting be held on 2 Saturdays instead of 1 increases at least the number of days codified in law for which individuals can vote early, and specifically on the weekends when most people are free and therefore have access to the polls. So I think that's really important. I definitely think it's really important for reducing the burden of long lines, which is a major problem in Georgia, and something that needs to be solved going forward. And so hopefully something like extending the number of days to vote early makes a difference. Now, granted, that's not going to affect some counties that already had 2 Saturdays of early voting, but it is not restricting counties from voting early. And I believe that, Dr. Hood mentioned that there are some requirements in the bill to create new precincts in places that lack resources and have been burdened by long lines. And, I think that, again, is really important. So anything that's done to reduce lines to vote in person is of the utmost importance in this state. And we've seen changes to election administration in Florida have a really, like adding early voting in Florida, have a major impact on reducing the burden of lines in Florida. And so hopefully we're moving in that direction with Georgia as well. My major concern, I think, in terms of what this bill does on a partisan basis is transferring voting power on the board of elections from the Secretary of State to the state legislature, sort of removing the Secretary of State from the board as a voting member. I'm not exactly sure how this plays out, but it certainly makes the board a lot more political than it was. I mean, it was certainly political before, but it makes it more political than it was. And, the legislature, we're gearing up for redistricting. We're in a redistricting cycle right now. As you know, the legislature is less representative of the population because of redistricting and because of districts. So there's some bias. And so that is definitely moving the Board of Elections to Republicans, and where you could have Democrats winning statewide elections and yet Republican legislatures still being in control of the Board of Elections. So that is my main concern. And that's it. That's all I have to say.
Great. Thank you so much for those insights. Dr. Cohen, you're up next.
Thanks, David. It looks like I'm sorry, Dr. Cottrell, your mic is still on, which I only say because I do this to myself all the time and I wind up making odd noises on Zoom calls. So I wanted to start by just saying thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts about this new law. And also thank you everybody for showing up. Again, it's the end of the semester, kind of one of the longest and worst of all time. So bravo to all of you for being here to learn something on a Friday afternoon, no less. So before I start, I want to be really clear and upfront about the ways that I come at questions about this law. As a person who is not a lawyer, but who studies public opinion and elections and democracies around the world. I have a very strong normative preference for liberal democracy. Just want to be upfront about that. What does that mean? The word liberal doesn't refer to any particular ideology. When I say, excuse me, liberal democracy, I'm talking about the idea that in elections, parties should compete on a level playing field, and voters should have relatively unimpeded access to the franchise. So this doesn't mean no limitations should be placed on who can vote, but it does mean that I view access for parties and for individuals as being really important in a democracy. So my expertise is not on the United States. I do work in the United States, but I mostly work in the developing world, especially in Latin America. So because my focus is on comparing across countries, I thought it might be helpful to give a more sort of global perspective on election administration to help situate this recent law in a broader context. So first, I think it's important to understand that the design of our electoral system in the United States isn't monolithic. In fact, in many ways, the ways that elections are run in the United States are extremely strange. For example, take the partisan makeup of our subnational electoral system. In democracies around the world, it's actually pretty uncommon to have elected officials in charge of election administration. Half of all countries in the world, so more than half of democracies, because there are lots of authoritarian countries that hold elections, have nonpartisan electoral commissions whose membership is determined by experience and or expertise. Only about half as many countries have mixed systems like ours, where partisanship is a factor in determining membership in an electoral commission. Generally, around the world, sort of experts in comparative electoral integrity view these nonpartisan administrations as superior, in part because nonpartisan administrators aren't prone to claims or accusations that they've tilted the playing field in favor of their preferred party. So one important piece of contextual information. A second important piece, I think, of contextual information has to do with the relative trust that Americans have in elections. Compared to other advanced democracies, we're doing really bad. So the 2017 to 2020 Wave of the World Values Survey, this is a cross-national survey project, which asks nationally representative samples of citizens around the world questions about just a host of other things, but among other things, beliefs about electoral integrity. The US ranks 22nd out of 78 countries in terms of beliefs that elections are fair very often or fairly often. So this puts us well behind other advanced democracies. We're into a second tier of trust in elections. So you sort of, when you line countries up from high to low, you see a grouping of countries at the top, and we are well below that. In fact, if you only look at that category, that elections are very often fair, election officials are fair very often, excuse me, only 22.5% of Americans think that that is the case. That places us squarely in the middle of this cross-national distribution, so even further down. So, of note, this was before the 2020 election. So this is before we see the manufacturing of claims about electoral fraud and sort of the heightened importance or concern about electoral integrity within our country. Okay, so a third piece of important contextual information from within the United States has to do with the ways that Americans ourselves view electoral integrity. So Dr. Bankert was telling us how our partisanship fuels everything. It also shapes the way that we understand what a free and fair election is. So evidence shows, recent evidence, that voters' perceptions of what fraud means are polarized by their partisanship. So when Republicans think about electoral fraud, they're thinking about ballot security. So limiting the ability to vote illegally. So they want to increase provisions that sort of limit the insecurity, potential insecurities to the ballot on average. Democrats, on the other hand, when they think about fraud, think of voter suppression. So they're thinking about limited access to the polls. things like longer wait times. And so Democrats want reforms that decrease those burdens, again, on average. Everybody likes voter ID though, it turns out. Americans are super in favor as a whole of voter ID. So because we're not thinking about the same thing as citizens when we talk about election fraud, it's really hard, it turns out, to make common sense reforms that the public as a whole supports. So instead we wind up seeing these reforms as, limiting security, which makes Republicans nervous, or as limiting access, and that makes Democrats nervous. And so everybody retreats to their camps, to their corners, instead of having a conversation about what's actually in the bill, what's good about the bill, what's less good about the bill, and what are we actually trying to maximize here for our democracy. Okay, so with all of that in mind, with respect to this specific law that we're here to discuss, the look of this law, this is bad, sort of irrespective of your beliefs about the content of the bill. And to be clear, there's lots of good stuff in this bill, which I think that Dr. Hood and Dr. Cottrell both touched on, right? There were specific pieces of the original law as proposed and debated in the House that were pretty clearly problematic, right? They were going to disproportionately affect minority groups. They got a lot of play in the news. This discussion of ending all early voting on Sundays, restricting early voting on Sundays, for example. Those didn't make it into the final bill. It's a good thing. But the fact that they were under consideration in the first place, I think, made a lot of people anxious about the bill's intent, and with good reason. So you have people who are already a little bit anxious because they hear that the Republican House is passing a bill on partisan lines. They hear that there's debate about Sunday voting, which is go time for souls to the polls, and so you see a lot of anxiety. The timing of the law also makes it seem like it's a reaction to the 2020 election, when, as we may or may not remember, Trump tried to pressure local Georgia election officials who ran a clean election to find votes for him in the results. So what is the goal of this? Well, we can't know. As Dr. Bankert says, we're making inferences. So one possible goal is to increase public trust in elections. That's been the claim of folks in the State House. So are we increasing trust in elections because we actually have a problem, or are we here to solve a problem of electoral integrity? Again, because we see different things when we think about electoral integrity, these changes that we're seeing are likely in the law, are likely to affect folks in different ways. At the same time, interestingly, by passing this law, officials are intentionally or not signaling to voters that there's reason for concern about electoral integrity in the state of Georgia, which could actually further depress trust in elections and make people even more likely to retreat to their corners because they feel anxious and angry and worried. Okay, I want to repeat something I mentioned earlier. There are some really good things in this law. So guaranteeing that counties will have more days and hours of early voting is a good way to improve access. That's a good thing. Creating drop boxes for absentee ballots in case there are delays with USPS in places that didn't have them before, that's a good thing. Could the specifics of these provisions be improved? Like, yeah, sure, absolutely. But I think we should recognize that this isn't sort of a uniformly suppressive bill. I also wanted to sort of touch on this, again, from a comparative perspective, this discussion of the electioneering provisions that now explicitly include mention of food and water. So there's been a lot of focus on this provision in the national news and local news. It's controversial because we have very long lines in Georgia, and that these lines are disproportionately located in majority-minority precincts. So advocates view this measure as stopping groups from supporting the voting rights of individuals who, through no fault of their own, are stuck in lines for 8, 10, 12 hours on election day with no food or drink. So I do want to note that, in comparative perspective, this kind of prohibition is actually very common. It's not unusual at all. Giving any sort of good or service to someone in an election line can be seen as an attempt to sway their vote. And vote buying is anathema to accountability. It's bad for electoral integrity. Probably the cost of a vote is higher than a bottle of water in the United States. In Nicaragua in 2010, the going rate was a chicken, which is more costly than a bottle of water. But certainly you can see how there's a relationship between these two things. I think that, by focusing so much on the provision of food and water, we overlook the fact that the real problem is the lines are too long. We need to fix the underlying problem rather than the Band-Aid solution, I think. And, again, one of the things that this law does, it has a provision to fix, is the length of these lines. If a polling station has more than 2,000 people voting in it and lines are longer than an hour, you got to add a new precinct. So we'll see if that has the intended effect of shrinking wait times, but I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. One last sort of set of notes here. So there's a lot of good stuff here, right? On the other hand, I think that some of the really potentially insidious parts of this law have actually received very little public attention. So as Dr. Cottrell mentioned, removing the Secretary of State from his voting position on the State Board of Elections is pretty clearly, well, feels like, and if, in fact, some members of the State House have said that it is a punitive response to his behavior in 2020. Remember how I said that partisan election administration isn't ideal? If partisanship is going to play a part in creating election boards, which, if the legislative majority is selecting the board's leader, it clearly is, even if that individual is nominally nonpartisan, it seems foundational for public trust in that figure that there's some accountability mechanism. And by making that new head of the board an unelected individual, there is no means for the public to hold anybody on that election board accountable, except through sort of normal means of elections, removing legislators from the chambers of the State House. Similarly, I think that these provisions allowing for performance reviews of underperforming districts haven't received a lot of attention. To be clear, so when I have seen them discussed in the news, folks are saying like, oh, if you don't like the way an election turns out, the State Board of Elections is just gonna go shut down the local Board of Elections, they're gonna cancel the result and all hell will break loose. They just won't certify results from whatever county. And that's not what the law says. There's actually a pretty lengthy process here. It's a pretty involved process in order to review these counties and remove bad actors at the local level. But I think it's also highly likely that the threat of performance review from a partisan and unaccountable body will shadow the way that local administrators behave, and that there is a lot of potential for abuse in this new mechanism that we should certainly be, I think, aware of and on the lookout for moving forward. There's obviously a lot more to say about the potential downstream effects of this law, but for citizens' perceptions of electoral integrity, for political polarization, for election outcomes, but for now, I'm going to leave it there. So thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. So before we go to our last panelist, I want to remind our attendees that there is a Q&A function. So if you have questions that you would like to hear from the panelists on, please submit your question and we'll try to get to it. All right, so Dr. Clay, you are our final panelist here. So take it away.
Thanks, Dr. Turnbull, and thanks to everybody for being here. Like Dr. Cohen said, it's really great that you all chosen to take some of your Friday to talk to us about this. I really appreciate everybody being here. So, as Dr. Turnbull said earlier, I'm a human rights scholar, and so, my role in this panel is not to dig deep into sort of the American politics of the situation. I see my role in this panel as placing U.S. electoral practices in the context of international human rights law, particularly as it pertains to the right to political participation as defined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So I'll start by calling back to Dr. Bankert's earlier point about the chosen comparison being important, right? In this case, I'm largely going to be comparing the United States to other countries, especially high-income democracies, and to sort of the ideal type of political participation as it's written explicitly in international human rights law. And so, not really comparing Georgia to other US states or comparing Georgia to the world, but kind of taking the US as a whole and thinking about how Georgia's new electoral law plays into that. But in order to properly do all that, I have to start by discussing the US's overall human rights record a bit to just, help us really understand the context here. So on that front, I think it's important that we start by setting aside any illusions any of us might have of the United States as a global leader on human rights. Of the 18 treaties that make up the core of the international human rights regime, the United States has ratified 5. 189 countries have ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The US is one of 8 that hasn't. 171 countries have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The US is one of 26 that hasn't. And in fact, perhaps most damningly, the US is the only UN member state that hasn't ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So when it comes to international human rights law, the US just simply hasn't been a leader. However, the US has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the document at the international level that provides the right to political participation, sort of the force of law, right, and obligates states to respect, protect, and fulfill that right. And the United States has ratified the International Covenant on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, which, among other things, attempts to make the protections against racial discrimination in international human rights law more robust. So you might hope, that combination of things might make the US's, express commitment to civil and political rights sort of play through in practices. That sadly also is not the case. If we look at physical integrity rights, so these are the rights to be free from arbitrary physical coercion by one's government, which includes things like the right to be free from torture, political and arbitrary imprisonment, extrajudicial killing and disappearance. The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, my measurement project that Dr. Turnbull mentioned earlier, finds that the US's performance is middling at best among the countries we have data for, and the worst among the high-income democracies on which we collect data. It's not just our data set that says that. If you look at Christopher Ferris's human rights protection scores, in 2019, those scores placed the United States 142nd out of 194 countries on physical integrity in 2019, which is just barely above the bottom quartile. So, certainly not doing well on those rights in the ICCPR. Now, the reason I've prefaced my comments on political participation with all of this stuff that isn't political participation is because I didn't want it to shock you when I said the United States as a whole has performed remarkably poorly on the right to political participation for many, many years now. This is not a new occurrence. It's not a new thing. This is just something that has been recognized by the international community for, at least more than a decade. So, based on the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the general comments of its associated treaty body, which is called the Human Rights Committee, the right to political participation has a broad, typically UN-like long definition that has been expounded on in a number of places. And I'm happy to run through that whole definition with you in Q&A if you really want to hear it. But for the purposes of just running through what I'll be talking about now, I'd like to focus on the fact that it ensures the right to vote in genuine periodic elections in which everyone can vote equally with secret ballots, and it obliges the states to ensure that there is no discrimination in political participation, that voter registration does not serve as a restriction on the enjoyment of the right to vote, and that barriers to voting such as homeless, literacy, poverty, language, or mobility limitations are completely overcome in the enjoyment of the right to vote. So this is probably the right that the US government has most vehemently promoted internationally, but we don't do that well on it at home. As with physical integrity rights, right, the Human Rights Measurement Initiative finds that the US is the worst performing high-income democracy on this right in the set of countries for which we collect data. Once again, it's not just HRMI, which is what we call the Human Rights Measurement Initiative for short, that says this. In their most recent scores, Freedom House ranked the United States 74th out of 195 countries on political rights, which for their work includes things like free and fair elections and political participation, right? And so why are these scores so low? Why is the US doing poorly on this? Well, the international human rights community has been telling us these reasons for quite some time. As a state that's ratified the ICCPR, the US has to file reports with the Human Rights Committee every few years to demonstrate the degree to which it's meeting its legal obligations under that treaty. And if we look at the concluding observations that the committee filed back in 2014, its recommendations are as follows. The state party should ensure that all states reinstate voting rights to felons who have fully served their sentences, provide inmates with information about their voting restoration options, remove or streamline lengthy and cumbersome voting restoration procedures, as well as review automatic denial of the vote to any imprisoned felon, regardless of the nature of the offense. The state party should also take all necessary measures to ensure that voter identification requirements and new eligibility requirements do not impose excessive burdens on voters and result in de facto disenfranchisement. That was in 2014, right? Based on the tenor of my comments so far, it'll probably come as little surprise to you that as of 2019, the human rights practitioners that work with us at Hermy stated that voter ID laws, poor access to physical polls and other alternative voting measures, limitations on voting registration and absentee balloting, and felony disenfranchisement all serve to disproportionately reduce enjoyment of the right to political participation by Black, Latinx, and poor people in the United States. Further, as a UN member state, the US also has to go up for this thing called Universal Periodic Review every 5 years. And in fact, it just concluded its latest round at the UPR in late 2020. And that review largely backed up all of the same stuff that I've said before, right? That the use of voter ID requirements had a discriminatory impact, and it was brought up repeatedly by members of the Human Rights Council as something that must be altered in order to bring the US's practices in line with the right to political participation as it's enshrined in international law. Further, it was discussed that the US should do more to expand access to additional methods of voting and increase access to those methods to sort of overcome any barriers to access disproportionately experienced by people of particular races, people with disabilities, and people with lower socioeconomic status. And just as a side note, another thing that came up in that review is that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was cited repeatedly as having determined that US elections simply do not meet international standards on these issues. So that's all a lot of table setting to say it's in this environment, right, that the Georgia legislature introduced SB 202, which they call the Election Integrity Act of 2021. As my colleagues have said, right, I think the impact of this bill has been largely overplayed in the media. And there are some parts of this law that will improve access to the vote, right? I mean, an example that pops into my head is that, there are some less populated counties where people are going to have more access to weekend voting now, right? Where in the past that wasn't guaranteed, now it's guaranteed as a result of this law. So there are some ways in which this law will increase access for some people. That said, the law serves, as others have pointed out, and I don't need to reiterate too much, it serves to double down on some of the very practices that the international human rights community have been calling on the US to end for years now, right? It adds some voter ID requirements where they previously weren't present, right? And that's with absentee ballots. And, it doesn't provide for increased access to those IDs, right? It's not sort of, like my colleagues have brought up, that there's a lot of support for ID requirements. There's nothing wrong in international law with ID requirements, as long as it's effectively costless to have an ID. That's not the case in the United States right now, right? And so if that limitation didn't exist, this wouldn't be a problem. As it stands, it is. It also reduces access to alternative forms of voting by decreasing the window for requesting absentee ballots and by reducing the number of and access to drop boxes compared to last year. I understand that was an emergency thing, but last year's access to drop boxes was much higher than it will be under these new laws. So overall, the law mostly serves to reinforce the very problems that have been being brought up by the international human rights community with the US's right to political participation, rather than do anything to resolve them. You know, further, it just seems important to reiterate that international law requires the government to respect, protect, and for the purpose of what I'm saying, most importantly, fulfill the right to political participation. That last aspect, the obligation to fulfill the right, means that the state is legally obligated to exert positive effort to ensure that every single person can vote if they so desire. Last year's election, right, the 2020 election that, as Dr. Cohen brought up, this law, in many ways, it's hard not to read this law as a response to, right, saw the highest voter turnout in a presidential election witnessed in my lifetime, right, and actually for a fair number of years prior to my lifetime. And in many ways, that should be viewed as a step in the right direction in ensuring the enjoyment of the right to political participation in the United States. More people voted as a proportion of the population last year than have voted in a very long time. Instead, it's been painted by some as a fraudulent failure that merits a doubling down on all of these poor practices that the US has repeatedly been criticized by the international human rights community, right? And it places us, out of step with other high-income democracies that do a much, much, much better job of ensuring the people within their borders the right to vote, right? And so, from an international human rights perspective, U.S. law and practice should be changing in such a way that ensures that more people enjoy their right to vote, not fewer. And while this bill may not ensure that a massive number fewer enjoy the right to vote, it certainly doesn't do anything to ensure that many more will, which is the direction that all sort of human rights law says the U.S. should be moving in. And so, it seems that this just simply isn't a step in the right direction, and just serves as a continuation of the U.S.'s current status as likely the poorest performing high-income democracy on human rights in general. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists. So we have a few questions that people submitted when they registered. We have a few questions that we're getting from the audience right now. So I'm going to try to select a few from both pots, so to speak, that hopefully kind of push the conversation forward, maybe picking up some themes that our panelists have already talked about. So this comes from someone who submitted this when they registered. One is, could you discuss some of the myths and or misconceptions surrounding this new law? Which false claims do you believe to be the most harmful to people's perception of our democracy, and why? This is actually a three-part question, sorry. And how has the media shaped those public perceptions? And I'll just open it up for any of our panelists who would like to take that.
We've all gotten very good during the pandemic at staying quiet and waiting for somebody to respond to a question. Like that was the longest thing I've ever seen happen there. So I'll jump in with just like my response to because I tolerate silence horribly in general. I'll jump in with my response to the most harmful thing. I mean, it's merely that voter fraud was commonplace and has been commonplace in U.S. elections, right? We know from multiple studies that voter fraud is the exception rather than the rule. From the cases that have been identified, it doesn't particularly seem to come from one political party or the other more often than not. It's fairly well distributed in the very small number of cases in which it occurs. And, it just, we have plenty of research that demonstrates this isn't a problem. And yet, I think and I suspect many of my colleagues consistently find myself having to defend that the electoral system is not rife with fraud in the United States, right? And that seems to be, I think, in my mind, the most harmful, rumor that's been started and seems to have an everlasting hold over the last, decade on the minds of particular parts of the electorate.
Okay, I can move to another
I'd just
question.
like to second that. I'm trying to find the mute button. So,
Yeah, it can be a real challenge sometimes. I do this all the time, but please go ahead, Dr. Cottrell.
yeah, so I mean, I totally agree with that. That this issue of voter fraud and election integrity is highly damaging to our elections and our democracy. It reduces confidence in the election results. I mean, we see that the University of Georgia had a poll out that, where we asked some questions about how people felt about the integrity of the election before the election was actually conducted. And then we followed up with them later and asked the same question. And, people's views of this election have been extraordinarily polarized in terms of their feelings about election integrity. And I think that's a huge problem. It presents a lot of challenges in order to bring that confidence back. Exactly how to do that is very, I guess I don't have all the answers there, especially in the type of political climate that we live in, which Professor Bankert was talking about. And, is that in some sense, there were a lot of challenges to this signature matching, and the subjectivity was signature matching. And you could see how easily elected officials and the president of the United States can start to question, this sense of subjectivity. So by creating a more objective measure, by using a voter ID number or a driver's license number, does that bring about the confidence that is required? But then again, you're sort of sacrificing access. And so there is this balance, and we're definitely need to find that balance because confidence in elections is crucial. And so it requires us to make sure that when our elected officials make claims about voter fraud, that we, as voting citizens, do our due diligence to not just believe those claims, just because they're said. And I don't have all the solutions, but that's a big concern. So I think definitely these lies around voter fraud are highly damaging. Anyway.
I think there's another piece to this, to sort of, again, go back to the comparative perspective here. Dr. Turnbull, it turns out, is an expert on post-election violence. So she knows better than anybody that, these persistent myths about election fraud, or truths about election fraud, lead to increased rioting, an increased sort of likelihood of post-election violence, pre-election violence, and people die and governments fall. And the United States is a special country in the way that all countries are special, but we are not immune from these pressures. And, we saw that on January 6th. So I don't want to link this law to January 6th. That's not my intention here to say that laws like this lead to militants storming the Capitol. That's not my argument. But I do think that shortly in the aftermath of an election that was unnecessarily contested, We're sort of made to feel fraudulent unnecessarily and without any evidence, or compelling evidence anyway, that this type of bill, passing this type of bill, doesn't do anything to lower the temperature. And I know that we don't always have to lower the temperature. Sometimes it's good to turn the heat up a little bit. But right now, I think what we need to be doing is thinking about ways to restore, to Dr. Cottrell's point, trust in elections and beliefs in electoral integrity in our country. They've been declining for over a decade. Again, compared to the rest of the developed world, the rest of advanced democracies, they're pretty abysmal. And to Dr. Clay's point, that sort of feeling of low integrity reflects a lack of adherence to international norms in conducting free and fair elections. And so I think that giving in to sort of our instincts, and that's everybody reporting on this bill. That's the way that everybody is reacting to this bill. Returning to our corners and fighting about the contents of the bill and trying to frame it as suppression or as countermanding non-existent fraud. Both of those frames are damaging to democracy in the long term. And that's really troubling. In fact, of all of this, the piece that is most troubling to me is this polarization over elections themselves, which turns into polarization over the perpetuation of democracy itself.
Okay, great. This next question comes from an audience member. How is voter ID racially discriminatory?
So I'm happy to start the answer for that question. I hope some of my colleagues have stuff to add, but once again, coming from my same perspective of international human rights law and international human rights measurement, right? So, and I think one way to look at this is, while I mentioned earlier, the US hasn't ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we do still measure how the US does according to those standards in that bill. We have signed that treaty. We've just never ratified it. It's never made its way through Congress. And so my fellow co-founder of Hermy, Susan Randolph, focuses on social and economic rights. And she did a study a few years ago that looked at social economic rights like the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to a job, the right to housing, the right to food, and the right to education, right, across all 50 US states. And one of the key findings from her work is that there was no state in which Black people enjoyed their economic and social rights at anything approaching the level as white people in that state. There's just no location in the country where they come close to one another. The gap in the enjoyment of economic and social rights and in the state's ability to sort of live up to what international law would expect from them persists across the United States. Now, the existence of that, gap in not only wealth and not only money, but also in the basics that the international human rights regime have deemed necessary for a life of dignity. So basic access to education, basic access to housing, to work, to an income. All of those things mean that there are, racially different effects of requiring an ID at the polls, right? Because acquiring an ID does require many of the resources you get by the enjoyment of those very economic and social rights, right? I'll use Athens as an example. I don't know how many of you have had to get a driver's license in Athens, but it's not the place where you get your driver's license is not located in the middle of downtown. It's not a place that's easy from my perspective to get to. It's actually quite difficult. It's a good bit out of the center of town. It's kind of hard. So access to transportation, access to a vehicle, access to the money and the time necessary to go to a DMV and wait there, right? Now, don't get me wrong, there have been things that the US has introduced to make access to an ID easier and cheaper, but the differential there still hasn't been resolved. It's still much clearly easier for someone with money and resources and access to transportation to obtain an ID than it is for somebody who lacks those resources. And because there is a racial difference in access to those resources, then the impact of requiring a voter ID, the impact of requiring a state-issued photo ID to do these sort of things, right, ultimately means that there is a differential impact across races of that requirement, right? And that Black people are less capable of sort of accessing the vote on average than white people are when you pass those laws, and you don't reinforce them by making IDs easy to obtain for everyone. So that's where the sort of international human rights community looks at like the US's voter ID requirements, sees that the US doesn't just sort of automatically give you a state issued ID for registering the vote, right? And says like, well, clearly this is a way in which a secondary form of registration is having a discriminatory impact on the enjoyment of the right to political participation.
All right, this next question also comes from our audience, and I think it's great for this panel because it puts election administration in comparative perspective. So on the spirit of comparing countries, here in Brazil, the state, especially its judicial branch, has historically a huge role in organizing elections. It seems to me as if the organization of elections out there in Georgia / the US falls on the shoulders of the competitors, that is, parties. It also feels weird that states have that much autonomy in deciding how people choose presidents. Is there a scenario where the union, I think this person means probably the US, or maybe not, anyway, either via courts or via national legislation, intervenes in creating a minimally uniform electoral system? Do you think heterogeneity is harmful?
This is a great question. Who asked that? Lucas. Lucas, if you're a student, this is like a doctoral dissertation and a half. This is like 3 books. This is a whole academic career on this question. This is really hard to answer. So like the US is very abnormal in the way that we run elections. This idea that different states determine the laws governing the way that elections are run, it seems very normal to us when we live here, but in comparative perspective, as you note here, is very uncommon. So most countries around the world have we have a federal elections commission. We do have a single unified body that sets, ground rules for the ways that elections are run. But ultimately, much of the way that elections are run is left to states and even to counties within states. So within back in 2000, within the state of Florida, this was like a very controversial election. It was decided by a few votes in a couple of counties in Florida. Different counties had different ballot designs. There's not a single uniform ballot that we all vote using. There's not a single vote technology that we all vote using. In comparative perspective, super weird. In most countries, there is a single ballot design that folks use. Some people, in Brazil, everybody uses an electronic ballot. That ballot looks pretty much the same everywhere. The candidates are different across constituencies. You punch the number in anyway, so you're not really seeing the whole ballot, but that's neither here nor there. So yes, it's very strange. Is it good or bad is kind of like a really hard question to answer, I think. In some ways, I think it's actually very good because this is such a big and diverse country with so many diverse interests. And there is an argument to be made that having sort of independent fiefdoms prevents against a sort of central figure coming in and ruling top down and sort of overturning elections centrally, or interfering in or manipulating elections centrally. You can sort of imagine a scenario where you have an incumbent president who doesn't want to leave power, who makes a phone call to a local election commission and says, find me 11,000 votes. And that commission is organized centrally and is under the thumb of that incumbent leader. And so rather than saying, no, we're not doing that, I am electorally accountable to my constituents, that election administrator says, okay, I'll try and find the 11,000 votes. So I think that there are pros and cons here, especially in a country like this one that is so big and has such diverse interests. It seems very unlikely to me. As a non-court watcher, it seems extremely unlikely to me that the United States will make a move to unify or make sort of uniform election procedures and stick us all under the administration of a single electoral authority with sort of superseding power over local boards. This is in part because of the type of federalism we have here. It's like a very extreme type of federalism with a lot of respect for local governance. It's a political culture and a political history issue as much as it is anything else. Yeah, but again, like this is a great question.
All right, I think we have time for one more question or so. So to what extent were long lines in Georgia a result of using machines instead of pen and paper and the need for social distancing combined with abnormally high turnout as opposed to other factors?
Well, I can respond a little bit to that. There are a lot of reasons for lines with elections. The state of Georgia has done a lot to speed up things recently. If you've been to vote in person, like in the last election cycle, it's very quick to check in with your, if you have an ID, and you have to have an ID to vote in person. So that's really become streamlined. There was probably a little bit of delay because the new ballot marking devices that we're using were new to a lot of voters in the last election cycle. So it was a new process. So that'll speed up, I think, as voters become more used to the election equipment. Now, it's a little bit ironic that some of the longest lines you're going to see are at the early part of the early in-person voting period, especially in the Atlanta area. Ironically, if you lived in Atlanta and you waited till election day to vote, there are many more precincts open on election day. You could walk in, probably wait a few minutes, 5 minutes to vote on election day. So, the state's trying to do something about the lines, but some of the lines are actually created by people clamoring to vote at the very beginning of the early voting period in especially large metropolitan areas. So a lot of the voting, especially on election day, isn't necessarily hampered by long lines. So I'll just leave it there and let somebody else jump in.
So I'll make a statement about this. So I guess I don't think that it has to do with machine voting instead of pen and paper. Honestly, you may get a hiccup with the machine voting and the transition to machine voting that causes a line, but this lines were going on before machine voting, and you see these lines appear in places that are overburdened. They're dense urban areas, and they generally lack resources. So the idea is that when you have more people to deal with, you need to have more resources to deal with them. If you don't have the resources to deal with this burden, then you're going to get lines. You're going to get really, really long lines. And so there's really, I don't think that there's blaming things on the voting technology is really the way to go. I think it is much more a resource allocation story. And, you know, I think, again, some of what is in this bill, you know, if it is in fact trying to increase the number of precincts and therefore increases the amount of resources to deal with voting lines, you know, I think that's important. Again, so I've done research on voting lines in Florida, and you know, there was 1 week of early voting in Florida, and the lines were egregious in only some places. I mean, in most places you go, you don't wait in line. There's no problem, you know, especially with a week of early voting. But in these dense urban areas, you know, where they're dealing with a large population of in-person voters during the early voting period, you know, people were waiting in line all day, and the lines existed all day. I mean, it was just a complete, you know, a massive queue of people just trying to get in. And then, you know, in Florida, they extended the early voting period and made a few other changes, and a lot of those lines went down. So the nice part about this issue of lines is that I think when you do make some administrative changes, you can actually make some really great improvements. But I think that has a lot more to do with dedicating resources and extending the early voting period, especially in certain places where you're going to be overburdened by the number of voters per precinct.
All right, I'd like to squeeze in one more question because I think it's a great question for our panel to end on. So this comes from Hannah O. What are some practical initiatives we could take as students, individually or collectively, to increase electoral confidence?
So I can tell you, just based on a little bit of my work, that kind of confidence in many cases is linked to education levels, but also just like to sophistication levels. So actually being able to understand politics, being able to seek out information about politics, that is a skill in and of itself that many of our students hopefully, you know, have at this point, or at least are willing to acquire. And that is already a pretty good thing for us as a society, because it turns out if you know how it works, you're also able to assess the process much more effectively. Now, of course, once again, partisanship factors in here. We actually have some evidence that very educated and sophisticated partisans are actually the worst sometimes at defending their partisan decision. So there is this paradox in there, right? But I think part of this is really to question yourself sometimes. And to be critical, not just of the members and the leaders of the other party, but actually even more so of the leaders and the members of your own party, right? And so just being able to remind yourself that nobody has a monopoly on truth. Nobody has a monopoly on morality or justice. I think those are the kinds of reminders that we have seen in research really work to decrease that polarization level that we have been seeing in the US, right? So remind ourselves that we do have things in common and we do want what's good for this country. That is, I think, the starting point of productive conversations that can hopefully overcome our partisan divide.
All right, great. And with that, I just want to thank our panelists for taking time out of a very busy semester to come share with us today how their research and expertise helps us make sense of the conversation surrounding this law, how we can understand it, and on this last point, what we can do to try to increase electoral confidence as citizens individually or collectively. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today as well. It was really wonderful being with you here virtually, and seeing your questions. We weren't able to get to all of them. That's just a function of having so many wonderful, great questions, but hopefully those questions in this panel will help facilitate future conversations down the road. All right, and with that, I just want to say thank you again, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of this beautiful Friday afternoon. Take care, everybody.